At my sister's wedding, they sat me by the fire exit with nothing but a dry piece of bread. My mother leaned in, pearls sharp against her throat, and whispered, "This suits you." My sister in lace smirked, "You make everything look cheap." In that moment, I felt every birthday forgotten, every graduation unattended, every Christmas card without my face. I was Clara Whitman, the shadow they taught to stay silent. But that night, silence ended. The chandeliers at the Harborview Grand glittered like frozen stars scattering light across the ballroom. White roses climbed the gilded columns, their fragrance mixing with the crisp chill of champagne. The sound of 200 voices layered over the string quartet laughter. Toasts, polite chatter that belonged to a world I was never part of. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald dress, modest, unadorned, the kind of fabric that whispered rather than shouted. As I stepped into the sea of silk gowns and black tuxedos, eyes skimmed over me, lingering just long enough to register that I didn't belong. My heels clicked on the marble until a young woman with a headset intercepted me, clipboard in hand. "Miss Whitman?" she asked, tone rehearsed. I nodded. "This way, please." She led me past rows of candlelit tables adorned with crystal glassware and embroidered menus, the kind of perfection my mother thrived on. My pulse slowed as we turned away from the center of the ballroom. The music grew muffled. She stopped beside the fire exit where the wall met a coat rack. "Here you are," she gestured. A small table sat waiting set for one. No flowers, no candles, no gilded menu, just a plain porcelain plate with a single piece of bread dry and cracking at the edges. My stomach dipped. I looked around searching for a waiter to correct what had to be a mistake, but the attendant was already gone. The string quartet swelled as my mother approached, gliding like a swan in her silver gown. Pearls hugged her throat, her smile elegant and hollow. "Darling," she said, bending down slightly, her perfume thick with gardenia. "So glad you could make it. You look comfortable." Her eyes flicked to the bread, and she gave a light laugh, the kind only I could hear. A simple meal for a simple life. Appropriate, don't you think? My jaw tightened, but I kept my face still. She didn't wait for an answer. She never did. She moved away, merging seamlessly back into the river of guests who kissed her cheek and praised her poise. I sat down, adjusting the hem of my dress over my lap, pretending not to notice the curious stares from nearby tables. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes, his eyes sliding right over me as though my chair were invisible. Then Lydia swept in radiant in lace and satin, a glittering veil pinned into her hair. Guests gasped and clapped, phones rose to capture the moment. She floated toward me, eventually stopping just close enough to lower her voice. "Big sister," she whispered, lips curved in a flawless smile. "You made it." I did. Her gaze dropped to the plate in front of me, then back to my dress. She tilted her head, smile sharpening, charming, very minimalist. There was a pause long enough for me to see the edge of satisfaction in her eyes. "You know," she added softly, "I've always admired how you make even the nicest things look cheap. It's a gift." I met her stare without blinking. My fingers slipped into my purse, wrapping around the small black USB that had been waiting there for weeks. I didn't pull it out, didn't brandish it like a weapon. I only let my thumb rest on its smooth surface, a silent promise to myself. Her smile faltered just slightly before she straightened again. "Enjoy the evening," she said, and turned her gown sweeping behind her as she returned to her audience. I looked down at the bread on my plate, dry, colorless, flavorless. A message carved into flour and crust. Around me, crystal glasses clinked, silverware chimed, laughter rippled. But at my table there was only silence and the faint red glow of the exit sign. I didn't touch the bread. Instead, I let my gaze linger on the ballroom lights, their golden reflections spilling across the marble. My hand stayed in my purse, fingers curled around the USB, the weight of a choice pressing into my palm. Not yet. For now, I waited. The ballroom lights blurred until they melted into a memory of dim park lamps flickering yellow against the evening sky. I was 10 years old again, sitting on a splintered bench in Greenfield Park, with a paper crown slipping down my forehead. A box of cupcakes rested on my lap, each one carefully frosted candles packed neatly beside them. I kept glancing at the entrance, waiting for familiar faces to appear. My mother had promised we'd celebrate there, just a small picnic, she said. I believed her. The shadows grew longer. The children around me were called home, their voices fading into the distance. I stayed until the park lights buzzed on moths tapping at the glass. An hour passed before it sank in. No one was coming. I opened the box anyway, stared at the frosting that was starting to melt, then closed it again. The cupcakes were untouched when I finally carried them onto the subway. The box balanced carefully on my knees as I sat alone, birthday hat still tilted on my head. While I rode home, my mother was across town with Lydia, escorting her into a modeling audition. I didn't know it then, but that would become the rhythm of my life, her spotlight, my shadow. The memory shifted, years slipping by, until I was standing on the football field at my high school graduation. Mommy. The June sun beat down on rows of white folding chairs, students tossing caps into the air. I stood in a borrowed dress, scanning the bleachers with a hopeful ache in my chest. Parents cheered, waved bouquets, embraced their children. I kept searching for two faces that never appeared. When the ceremony ended, I lingered on the curb while the crowd thinned out. I told myself maybe they were late, maybe traffic. But the truth set in when Julie walked up with her father. He saw me standing there empty-handed and asked, "Need a ride, Clara?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. On the drive back, I held my diploma in my lap the same way I once held those cupcakes, a gift no one cared to notice. Later, when my mother finally offered an explanation, her voice was smooth as ever. "Oh, we thought it was tomorrow. Lydia had a photo shoot." That thin smile of hers was meant to soften the blow, but it cut deeper than any harsh word. At home, the walls told the story more clearly than anyone ever would. Every Christmas card was taped neatly on the hallway board, my parents in coordinated sweaters, Lydia in front of the fireplace, Jonathan joining in the more recent ones. Perfectly posed, perfectly framed. I was never in those photos. Not once. My absence wasn't an accident. It was intentional, as if erasing me preserved their image. I used to trace the edges of those cards with my fingertip, wondering if maybe the next year I'd be invited into the frame. But the space I held in that house was always just outside the picture. My mother's voice still echoes in my memory, sharper than the click of her heels across the tile. Lydia was born to shine. "Clara, you're more of a shadow. Necessary but better when quiet." She said it once in the kitchen, wine glass in hand, not even looking at me. I remember how my cheeks burned, how I tried to shrink smaller, as if silence would make me disappear the way she wanted. I carried that sentence with me into adulthood like a bruise that never healed. It was easier to let the silence swallow me than to keep pressing against a door that would never open. Even now, sitting at the far edge of Lydia's wedding, the red glow of the exit sign painting my table, I could still hear it. A lifetime of birthdays, forgotten ceremonies, unattended photos without my face. All of it wrapped into one dry piece of bread placed in front of me. I blinked hard, pushing the memory down before it drowned me. Around me, the ballroom sparkled with laughter and champagne. But inside, I was back in that park, a child, clutching a box of untouched cupcakes. And I thought some patterns aren't accidents. They're choices. Choices my family made over and over again. The quartet began a new song, pulling me back into the present, but the echo of those words, shadow quiet, invisible, stayed pressed against my skin, as permanent as the pearls around my mother's neck. I lowered my gaze to the USB in my purse, feeling its weight against my palm. Not tonight, I told myself. Not yet. But the past had already sharpened me into someone who would no longer wait on the curb for a ride that never came. The envelope waited for me on the kitchen table, thick and ivory, my name printed in raised gold letters. Miss Clara Whitman. No sister, no warmth, just a title and a surname, as if I were a guest picked from some distant address book. I held it in my hands longer than I should have, running a finger over the gilded edges before I slid it open with a butter knife. Inside, the words gleamed like they were cut from metal. The Whitman and Langford families cordially invite you to celebrate the union of Lydia Ann Whitman and Jonathan Michael Langford. Beneath it, the details of the ceremony and reception spilled out in elegant script. Black tie champagne, only Harborview Grand Hotel, Boston. I set it down and laughed once under my breath, the sound dry. It wasn't an invitation. It was an announcement. The phone rang almost on cue. My mother's number. "Clara," she said, her voice clipped as though she had been rehearsing the call all morning. "I trust you received your invitation." "I did. Good. Then you understand this is not the time to make statements or draw attention. Lydia's wedding is important. The Langfords are a respected family. This is not an art exhibit, it is a formal occasion. Wear something appropriate. Please don't embarrass us." I let silence stretch between us long enough that she had to fill it with her own impatience. "Did you hear me?" "Finally," I said. "Don't worry, Mother. I'll blend into the wallpaper." She didn't appreciate the sarcasm. She never did. "See that you do," she said, and the line went dead. I stood there with the phone still against my ear, staring at the card glinting on the table. A script for the perfect family they'd been writing for years, one where I didn't even have a line. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again, a message from Lydia herself. Her tone came across as airy, almost affectionate, the way she had always used charm like currency. "Hey, sis, so glad you're coming. Quick favor. Could you snap some pics during the reception? Nothing fancy, just candid shots. You know you've got the best eye. And it would mean so much because you're family. And free, of course, haha." I read it twice, my throat tightening, my chest hollow. I pictured her tapping it out in some bridal boutique while attendants laced her into silk, assuming I'd say yes because I always had. I typed and erased 3 different replies before settling on the simplest one: I'd like to attend as a guest this time. I didn't bother waiting for her response. It never came. Days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon, the phone rang while I was editing photos in my studio. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something nudged me to pick up. "Miss Whitman," a young voice asked, "I'm calling from the Clarion Gallery on behalf of Sylvia Grant." I sat up straighter, heart skipping. "Yes, this is Clara. I'm happy to inform you that your series has been selected for our Spring Showcase Portraits of Solitude. Ms. Grant wanted you to know she found your submissions unflinching intimate. She said your work has something rare." I pressed my palm against my chest, grounding myself. "Thank you," I whispered. "That's incredible. We'll send a formal confirmation by email, but Ms. Grant wanted you to hear personally. Congratulations." When the call ended, I stayed frozen in the center of my studio, the hum of the city filtering in through the windows. My eyes blurred as I looked at the unfinished portrait on my screen, an elderly couple holding hands on a park bench. The quiet dignity in their faces seemed to mirror the tremble in my own hands. Without thinking, I called my mother. It rang 3 times before she answered. "Hello, Mom. I just wanted to share something. Sylvia Grant chose my work. The Clarion Spring Show. She called it rare." There was a pause just long enough for the hope in me to falter. "That's nice, Clara. I'm in the middle of finalizing seating for the wedding. Can we talk later?" The line went silent. I lowered the phone, placed it gently on the counter. The joy in my chest shrank back into its shell, tempered by the same dismissal I had known my entire life. I stood at my desk and picked up the invitation again, its embossed letters gleaming in the dim light. Beside it, my laptop pinged with the incoming email from Clarion Gallery confirming my place in the showcase. 2 invitations, one to a celebration that barely acknowledged me, the other to a stage that might finally see me. I held them both in my hands, the thick wedding card in one, the glowing email on the screen in the other. One spoke of duty, silence, and pretense. The other whispered of recognition, honesty, and art. And I realized I already knew which one mattered. I set the wedding card back down, pressing it flat with my palm. The gold letters caught the light, but they felt hollow. On the other side of the table, the email waited steady, certain promising something that had nothing to do with my family's approval. I breathed out slowly, the sound filling the quiet apartment. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faint outline of choice. The rooftop shimmered under strings of golden lights, the harbor stretching out below like a sheet of ink. Guests crowded near the railing glasses of champagne, lifted, waiting for fireworks to bloom over Boston Harbor. Lydia floated from one cluster of people to another, her gown a sweep of silver fabric that caught every flash of a camera. Jonathan was beside her, laughing with colleagues, a hand at the small of her back. His smile was easy, trusting. I moved along the edges of the party camera slung around my neck. It wasn't my intention to work, but carrying it felt like armor, a way to disappear without seeming rude. I caught shots of children darting between tables, their laughter cutting through the hum of polite conversation. I photographed a waiter pouring wine, the arc of the liquid catching the light. Little fragments no one else noticed. When I lowered the camera, my eyes caught Lydia standing apart from the crowd, half in shadow near a column. Her posture was taut, shoulders drawn in as she stared at her phone. The glow lit her features, serious at first, then softening into a smile far too intimate for the setting. She typed quickly, thumbs trembling slightly, and I angled myself instinctively, lifting my lens. Through the viewfinder, a single line on her screen came into focus before she tucked it away. "Tonight, one last time, my bed, not Jonathan's." The words punched the air out of me. I lowered the camera, blinking hard. She glanced around, slipping the phone into her clutch with practiced ease, and moved toward the private elevator. No one else noticed, or maybe no one dared. I hesitated for only a moment, then followed, keeping distance, my heels muffled against the carpet. She stepped into the elevator doors, closing around her reflection. I pushed through the stairwell door, the smell of concrete and dust wrapping around me as I hurried downward. My chest tightened with every floor. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe nothing, maybe confirmation of what I already knew. The garage was dim, the echo of my footsteps swallowed by the cavernous space. Lydia's silver coupe was parked near the far wall. She leaned against the hood, arms crossed, scanning the shadows. A black SUV rolled in, minutes later, tires crunching softly. A man stepped out, tall, dark coat fitted to his frame. His face was familiar. I'd seen him once at a charity event with Jonathan. Colin Maddox, a name whispered with admiration in Boston's tech circles. He walked straight to her. There was no hesitation. Lydia slipped into his arms, her body folding against his like it belonged there. The kiss was slow, deliberate. The kind of kiss that comes with history, not impulse. My breath caught. Without thinking, I raised my camera again, switched to video, and hit record. The frame captured everything: the curve of Lydia's smile, the way Colin's hand slid to her waist, the certainty in their embrace. I didn't zoom, didn't need to. The truth filled the lens on its own. They pulled apart briefly, speaking in voices too low for me to catch. Lydia laughed, brushing her fingers across his lapel. Then she opened the car door and they disappeared inside, shutting the world out. I lowered the camera slowly, my hands trembling. My pulse hammered so loud I thought it might echo through the garage. I stood there, rooted, until the sound of the engine revved softly. I backed away, pressing into the shadows, my camera heavy against my chest. I should have left it alone. That thought flickered through me even as I clutched the camera tighter. Maybe it wasn't my business. Maybe exposing her would only tear things apart further. But another part of me, the part that had been handed scraps my whole life, knew better. This was more than betrayal. It was proof, undeniable and brutal. When I finally climbed the stairwell back to the rooftop, the first firework cracked open the sky, scattering sparks over the harbor. Guests cheered, their voices rising with the glittering light. Lydia was gone from the crowd. Jonathan still smiling, oblivious, raising his glass to the night. I slipped to the edge of the terrace, leaned against the railing, and pressed my forehead to the cool metal. The video weighed on me, a secret burning in my pocket. My breath came uneven, shallow. Across the water, another firework burst, red and gold, raining into the harbor. I didn't raise my camera. My hands were already trembling from what I had captured, from what I could never unsee. And in that moment, with the sky exploding above me, I knew I held something more dangerous than any spark. The old Whitman house smelled of lemon polish and lavender when I slipped in through the side door, the one no one bothered to lock, because no one ever thought I would come back. My heels sank into the worn runner that stretched down the hallway, and I froze as voices drifted from the parlor. I recognized them instantly. My mother's crisp, measured tone, and Lydia's lilting reply. "The deed is finished," Margaret was saying, her words clipped like the tick of a clock. "The main house is in your name now, along with the Martha's Vineyard property, and the shares of Whitman Real Estate. Edward hasn't the faintest idea. He still thinks the lawyer handles everything." My throat closed. I pressed myself flat against the wall, my heart hammering in my ears. Lydia's laugh floated out, soft but sharp. "Perfect. After the wedding, it'll all be mine. The estates, the accounts, the trust. Clara can fade into her shadows. We'll keep her around just enough so people don't call us heartless, but that's all she's good for. A backdrop." The words hit harder than I expected. I slipped my phone out of my pocket, thumb shaking as I opened the recorder. The soft chime seemed loud in the silence, but neither of them noticed. My mother's voice dropped lower, intimate and conspiratorial. "You've done more for this family with this marriage than Clara ever could with her little gallery shows. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I bit down hard on my lip until I tasted iron. My sister, my mother, plotting futures where I didn't exist, erasing me with contracts and signatures. Lydia's voice followed, cool and certain. "I don't love Jonathan, not really. I love what his name means. I love the power it carries. That's what matters. Once the vows are said, I'll hold the pen, the accounts, the boardrooms. Boston will be mine." I pressed harder into the wall, the wood molding biting into my shoulder. My stomach twisted. Jonathan's face flickered in my mind, the way he had smiled so warmly at her at the engagement party. He didn't know. None of them did. A chair scraped and I flinched. I could picture them, my mother swirling her wine, Lydia pacing with restless energy, both of them speaking truths they'd never risk outside these walls. "Do you think she suspects?" Lydia asked after a moment. Margaret gave a short, dismissive hum. "Clara. She still thinks honesty means something. She's too naive to notice the ground shifting beneath her feet. Poor thing." The laughter that followed was brittle cold. I gripped my phone tighter, the recording time ticking upward in glowing red numbers. My nails dug into the case until I thought it might crack. I wanted to step into the room, to scream, to shatter the smug certainty in their voices. Instead, I stayed hidden. My breath shallow, the taste of blood on my tongue from where I had bitten through the skin. I thought of all the times I had convinced myself their cruelty was thoughtlessness, not malice. All the times I had told myself they simply didn't see me. But they did. They saw me perfectly. They just chose to erase me anyway. The conversation shifted to brunch menus and honeymoon itineraries, their voices growing lighter, more casual, as if they hadn't just carved me out of their future with a few signatures. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, easing away from the wall. Each step backward was careful, silent, measured. When I reached the side door again, I paused with my hand on the knob. My chest ached with the urge to cry, to collapse, right there on the polished floor. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled the door open, the cool night air rushing in to steady me. I stepped out into the darkness, closing it behind me without a sound, the recording heavy in my pocket. My lips stung warm blood, dampening the corner of my mouth, a reminder of how close I had come to breaking. But I hadn't. The tape was still running when I lifted my hand to wipe my mouth, smearing the red across my skin. The laughter from the parlor was muffled now, sealed behind the door, but it echoed in my head, sharp and endless. I stood alone in the driveway, the magnolia tree rustling overhead, and whispered to no one. "I heard you." Then I pressed stop on the recording. The harbor view grand glowed like a palace chandeliers spilling golden light over tables dressed in white silk. Waiters moved in perfect rhythm, filling glasses with champagne, balancing silver trays with hors d'oeuvres I would never taste. Cameras flashed, catching Lydia's every angle as she swept into the ballroom in lace and satin, her veil floating behind her like a banner of triumph. Margaret followed, close pearls catching the light, her smile tight and regal. She carried herself like a queen presenting her heir. Jonathan stood at the head table, his tuxedo pressed his face, lit with the ease of a man who believed this was the happiest day of his life. He clasped Lydia's hand when she reached him, lifting it to his lips, and the crowd sighed with admiration. I watched from the far edge of the room, tucked beside the glowing red exit sign, the draft of cold air sneaking through the crack in the door. My table was a graveyard of absence. No flowers, no menus, no wine, just the same bread, dry and cracking, waiting for me. It stared back at me as if mocking the hunger I had carried my entire life. I folded my napkin over my lap, straightened my spine, and let my eyes wander to the guests who laughed freely, who never once glanced my way. The band played a soft tune as couples took pictures, arms entwined, champagne flutes lifted high. The air was warm with perfume and the sweetness of sugared cake. I sat still invisible, my hand brushing the edge of my purse where the USB rested. The master of ceremonies, a tall man with a booming voice, tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, tonight we celebrate love, legacy, and family. Before we raise our glasses to the bride and groom, we have one final toast." I felt the room still around me as his eyes searched the crowd. Then they landed on me. A few words from the bride's sister, Miss Clara Whitman. The name echoed strangely in the ballroom as though it belonged to someone else. Heads turned, eyes following me like spotlights. I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the sudden hush. My palms were steady, though my heart rattled in my chest. I walked past tables glittering with crystal and gold, past faces painted with polite curiosity. Margaret sat tall, her eyes narrowing, a warning hidden in her smile. Lydia's lips curved upward, but the muscles in her jaw tightened. Jonathan turned toward me, expectant, a smile still lingering unaware. I stopped at the front, the microphone waiting. The MC handed it toward me. I shook my head gently. "I won't be offering a toast," I said, my voice clear enough to carry. A ripple of whispers fluttered through the room. I reached into my purse, pulling out the small black USB, its surface gleaming under the stage lights. My hand didn't shake. I turned to the technician seated near the projector, pressed the drive into his hand, and whispered, "Play this." He hesitated, eyes darting toward the MC, but then he nodded. The ballroom dimmed as the chandeliers lowered. The chatter cut off, glasses stilled in midair. The massive screen behind the head table descended, fabric rustling like a curtain before a play. I stepped back, folding my hands in front of me, the USB now out of my reach, but its contents thrumming inside me like a second heartbeat. The projector flickered, humming. A faint glow lit the faces of the guests as the first frame came alive. The air thickened, heavy with unease. Margaret stiffened, pearls frozen against her throat. Lydia shifted in her chair, eyes flashing. Jonathan leaned forward, brows drawn, waiting. I stood to the side, the red exit sign glowing faintly in the distance, my body still and my breath measured. And then the screen brightened fully, the first image casting its light across the room, plunging the celebration into silence. The screen lit up with the harsh glow of a phone, Lydia's manicured fingers tapping across the keyboard. The words magnified on the projection like a verdict. "Tonight, one last time, my bed, not Jonathan's." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The message hung there in silence, damning in its simplicity. Then the scene shifted. Grainy but clear enough, the video caught Lydia stepping out of her silver coupe in the dim garage, meeting Colin Maddox beneath the fluorescent lights. He wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, and their lips met in a kiss too practiced to be mistaken for impulse. The sound of rustling fabric echoed faintly, followed by her laughter, soft and intimate, a sound no one in that ballroom had ever heard from her before. 200 faces stared at the screen. Some turned away, but most couldn't. Jonathan sat rigid at the head table, his hand wrapped around his champagne glass until it shattered in his fist, the stem snapping with a sickening crack. The liquid spilled across the linen, spreading like a stain. Edward rose slowly from his chair, his face pale eyes locked on the screen, but his lips parted without a word. My father, always silent when it mattered most, stood useless watching his world collapse in front of him. The footage faded, replaced by darkness. Then came the audio. My mother's voice filled the ballroom, calm, clipped, unmistakable. The house and the vineyard estate are already in your name, Lydia. Edward hasn't touched the paperwork in years. He won't notice. Lydia's answering laugh rang out cruel and confident. Perfect. After the wedding, everything will be mine. Clara's just background. Keeps us from looking heartless. Whispers swept the room sharp as knives. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man shook his head in disbelief. Turn it off. Lydia's voice cracked shrill against the speakers. She pushed back from her chair, her gown tangling around her legs as she stumbled forward. This is fake. It's edited. But the audio rolled on merciless. I don't love Jonathan. Lydia's voice admitted, heavy with disdain. I love what his name gives me. That's all that matters. The words cut through the ballroom, leaving only silence in their wake. Jonathan's face drained of color. He stared at his fiancée as though seeing her for the first time, as though the woman beside him had been replaced by a stranger. Lydia turned toward the guests, her eyes wide, desperate. Don't listen to this, it's not real. She's obsessed with destroying me. Her gaze swung to me sharp and venomous. You did this, Clara. You've always been jealous. You couldn't stand my happiness, so you made this up. The recording didn't wait for her excuses. My mother's laugh filled the air, low and satisfied. You've done more for this family with this marriage than Clara ever could with her little pictures. Then both their laughs overlapped, rising cruel and certain. The sound rolled through the speakers and over the guests, a chorus of contempt that no one could deny. Every eye in the room shifted back to Lydia and Margaret. No one spoke, no one applauded, no one moved. The weight of that laughter pressed down on all of us, suffocating, undeniable. I stood to the side of the stage, the glow from the screen painting the room in cold light, my pulse steady despite the chaos unraveling in front of me. The ballroom was frozen, every secret laid bare, every mask ripped away, and for the first time in my life, the silence belonged to me. The doors at the side of the ballroom swung open, flooding the aisle with a strip of harsh light. A tall figure stepped inside his shoulders, squared his dark suit, cutting sharp lines against the glow. The murmurs swelled as guests craned their necks. I didn't need an introduction to know him. Colin Maddox. He walked with unhurried precision, each step echoing across the parquet floor until the music had all but faded. Lydia's face drained of color. She clutched at the edge of the head table, her knuckles whitening. Colin's voice was steady, almost too calm. She used me. She used all of us. And I have proof. A ripple of gasps traveled through the room. Lydia's composure shattered. Her voice shot out, high and desperate. He's lying. He's obsessed with me. He's been stalking me for months. Colin didn't even glance her way at first. He fixed his eyes on Jonathan, then on the Langford family seated at the head table. I didn't come here for revenge. I came because I won't be silent while she builds her empire on deceit. I loved her once. Briefly, foolishly, but what she's done to her sister, to her own father, to you, Jonathan, it can't be forgiven. The ballroom vibrated with silence, the kind that makes every breath sound too loud. Lydia stumbled forward, mascara streaking, voice breaking. "Don't listen to him. This is all Clara's doing. She set this up, she's trying to ruin me." Her words bounced off walls no one believed in anymore. I watched as Jonathan pushed back his chair. His hands trembled, but his movements were deliberate. He looked at Lydia, his eyes hollow with disbelief. Slowly, he slid the platinum band from his finger. "I loved a lie in a white dress." He said, his voice low but carrying through the stunned hall. Then he dropped the ring onto the table. The sound was sharper than I expected, a metallic ping that rang out and seemed to split the night in two. Guests flinched, some gasping aloud, others simply staring as the reality of it all sank in. Lydia reached out her hand, shaking as if she could somehow snatch the words back, the ring back, the life she had been building. But Jonathan had already turned away, his shoulders rigid as he faced his parents. The Langfords' silence spoke louder than anything else. Richard's jaw was clenched like stone, Helen's eyes cold and distant. They did not move to comfort Lydia, nor did they try to salvage the spectacle. They sat like statues, absorbing the collapse with a kind of practiced restraint that only made the moment more devastating. Around the room, whispers bloomed into full voices. "Unbelievable. I knew something was off. Poor Jonathan." Some guests rose quietly, gathering their coats, unwilling to witness more. Margaret reached for Lydia, her face pale but defiant. "This is nonsense," she hissed to anyone within earshot. "A conspiracy." "We are Whitmans, and no projection, no bitter man will change that." But the weight of the ring on the linen tablecloth, the broken glass near Jonathan's chair, and the proof still glowing in every guest's mind, told another story. I stood to the side, the projector still humming behind me, my pulse steady. The truth had spoken. It had walked into the room on its own 2 feet. And now it stood undeniable in the echo of that single sound. The hall seemed to inhale all at once, bracing for what would come next. Richard Langford rose from his chair, the scrape of wood against marble, cutting through the stunned silence. His frame was tall, commanding, his voice sharp as glass. As of this moment, he declared each word deliberate. "Langford Investments severs all partnerships and negotiations with Whitman Real Estate, effective immediately." The announcement rippled across the ballroom. Guests shifted, gasps and whispers spilling into the air like cracks in ice. A few clutched their phones, already composing the story in their heads, the kind that would travel through Boston's business circles by dawn. Chairs scraped back as the first clusters of guests began to rise, gathering coats, murmuring to each other in tones of disbelief. Margaret's face went white, then flushed a blotchy red. She gripped the table, then released it, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You," she spat, her voice breaking under its own weight. "You've destroyed us. You ruined your sister's wedding. You've humiliated this family in front of everyone." Eyes turned to me, but not with blame, only with a kind of quiet, unsettling recognition. No one defended her. No one echoed her accusations. They simply watched as Margaret unraveled. I stayed still, my hands folded in front of me, my breathing calm. I didn't need to answer. The truth had already spoken louder than I ever could. Lydia slumped into her chair, mascara streaking down her face. Her gown pooled around her like a collapsed curtain. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Jonathan, who had turned his back completely. She stared at the floor, her chest heaving shallow, as if the weight of her own choices had finally settled. My father, Edward, hadn't moved until then. He sat stiffly, hands gripping the arms of his chair, his tie loosened at the collar. Slowly, his gaze lifted and met mine. For the first time in years, he held it, not a fleeting glance, but something longer, heavier. His eyes brimmed with something close to sorrow, maybe even regret, though he didn't speak a word. Margaret spun toward him, desperate. "Say something! Do you hear what they're doing to us? Do you hear what she's done?" Edward stayed silent. His lips parted, then closed again. The weight of his stillness was louder than her shrieks. Around us, the ballroom continued to empty. Purses snapped shut, heels clicked against the marble coats, rustled from the racks. The grandeur that had been so carefully constructed unraveled in minutes. What was left was a hollow shell filled with shame and broken glass. Margaret's voice rose again, shrill and cracking. "We are Whitmans," she shouted, the words bouncing off the high ceilings, echoing against the chandeliers. "We are Whitmans." But her voice only chased the backs of retreating guests, their chairs dragging across the floor in harsh protest. The orchestra had gone silent long ago. The only sound now was the scrape of wood, the shuffle of feet, the heavy emptiness that followed every step leaving the room. I stood in the corner, my green dress brushing against my calves, watching the empire of appearances collapse. Margaret's cry echoed once more, thinner this time, fraying into the air until nothing remained but the sound of chairs scraping against marble and the final slam of the ballroom doors closing. The headlines hit the city before the cake from the wedding had even been cleared away. Boston Evening Journal. The wedding of the year. Implodes in scandal. Channel 7 News. Whitman-Langford union. Shattered by affairs, lies, and fraud allegations. Every outlet had its angle, but they all agreed on one thing. No family name fell harder that weekend than Whitman. Margaret's face appeared on the morning broadcasts, her photograph framed beside quotes pulled from the leaked audio. The woman who once chaired every luncheon and gala was suddenly radioactive. The Women's Heritage Society announced her resignation in a terse press release. Old friends stopped answering her calls. Even her hairdresser canceled their weekly appointment with a polite text that cut deeper than a slap. Edward's ruin came quieter but faster. 3 deals collapsed in less than a week. A luxury condo development in Back Bay, gone. A Cape Cod resort contract, withdrawn. A suburban shopping complex outside Worcester, halted. Millions vanished overnight, partners citing concerns about stability and values. He tried to salvage it, tried to call in favors, but every meeting ended in whispers that followed him into the elevator. Lydia's fall was the most spectacular. Within 48 hours, the fashion label she'd been the face of pulled her campaign. Agencies ghosted her calls. Her manager dropped her. She still had the condo in Back Bay, the designer heels stacked like trophies in her closet, but none of it mattered when her savings account blinked 0. Colin Maddox was gone. His apartment emptied, his social media scrubbed clean, the shared account she had built with him. Money siphoned away, not even crumbs left. She tried to log in again and again, convinced it was an error, but the balance never changed. Nothing. I heard through whispers that she paced the condo floors barefoot. Mascara streaked on her cheeks, calling his number until the voicemail clicked in like a wall she couldn't climb. The last message she ever had from him, "Relax, beautiful. After the wedding we'll be set," mocked her every time she replayed it. Then came the envelope, stiff cream-colored, delivered by certified mail. She tore it open in the silence of her living room. Inside, the seal of Suffolk County Court glared up at her. Langford Investments had filed suit demanding a full investigation into Whitman Real Estate's finances, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, asset concealment. Neighbors said they heard her crying through the walls that night. Others swore it wasn't crying, just a hollow sound like someone gasping for air that wouldn't come. I pictured her at that moment sitting in the dark, the letter trembling in her hands, the mascara bleeding down her face in thick black rivers. All the glamour stripped away, all the power she clutched, slipping through her fingers. And for the first time in her life, Lydia Whitman had no script, no spotlight, and nowhere left to stand. The studio smelled of fresh paint and coffee grounds the first morning I opened its doors. The space was small. Bare brick walls, wide windows spilling in Brooklyn light. But it was mine. My cameras lined the shelves like old companions finally given a proper home. I swept the floor myself, rolled down the backdrop, and let the quiet wrap around me like a kind of peace I had never known. Sylvia Grant arrived that afternoon, her umbrella dripping rain on the mat. She looked around with a sharp eye that missed nothing, her gloved hand brushing along the edge of my work table. "It's raw," she said, a smile tugging at her mouth. Good. Your show will need that. Invisible Lives. It's the perfect title. I nodded, my throat tightening, and managed to say, "Thank you." She leaned in closer. "Don't thank me. Just keep shooting the way you did that night. Don't hide from it anymore." When she left, I stood by the window and watched the city churn below, taxis, honking umbrellas, colliding people rushing with their own stories. For once, I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. The first client came a week later. A family of 4 from Queens. They wanted portraits, but not the polished kind. No touch-ups, the mother insisted. We just want to look like ourselves. I guided them into the studio, coaxed the kids to laugh by making faces behind the camera. The father adjusted his tie awkwardly while his wife kissed his cheek mid-shot. When I showed them the proofs, their eyes softened. "That's us," the mother whispered. For the first time, I felt what it was to give someone a piece of themselves they didn't know they'd lost. Word spread slowly. A retired teacher booked a session, then a jazz musician. Each wanted to be seen, not airbrushed. My calendar filled with real faces, real lives. Meanwhile, Boston turned its back on Lydia. The newspapers stopped writing her name. The charities refused her donations. Invitations vanished. She became a ghost in her own city, a headline turned cautionary tale. One night, as rain lashed the streets and the gutters overflowed, I heard a knock at the glass door of my studio. I almost ignored it. It was late, too late for clients. But the sound came again, hesitant, uneven. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. There she was, Lydia. Her hair plastered to her face, her designer coat soaked through, clinging like dead weight. She looked smaller, her shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed red. She didn't step inside until I moved back. Water dripped from her sleeves onto the hardwood floor. Her voice was raw, ragged. "I don't have anywhere else to go. Please, I'll do anything. I need something real." The words hung between us, fragile and strange. I studied her face, stripped of makeup, stripped of arrogance, nothing left but exhaustion. I didn't answer. I walked to the corner, lifted a broom, and held it out. "No words," I said quietly. "Just work." Her hands trembled as she took it. She lowered her head, bent to the floor, and began sweeping the puddles she had dragged in. The bristles scraped softly across the wood. Her movements clumsy at first, then steadier. I returned to my desk, lifted my camera, and let the shutter click quietly once. Not to humiliate her, not to save as evidence, just to remind myself that this moment was real. That the girl who once mocked me in lace now bent silently in the corner of my studio, cleaning my floor like a stranger. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, but inside the silence was heavier, thick with something unspoken. Forgiveness hadn't arrived. It might never, but consequences had, and they filled the room with every stroke of the broom. The gallery hummed with the kind of energy I had only ever watched from the outside. People filled the space, their voices low and reverent as they moved from frame to frame. Glasses clinked. Shoes clicked softly against the hardwood, but it wasn't noise. It was music, the kind that builds without breaking the silence. I stood near the far wall, not at the center where Margaret once would have demanded I be, but at the edge where I had always been most comfortable. Only this time people sought me out. Critics scribbled notes in leather-bound books. A young couple whispered to each other, pointing at one of my prints like it was a secret only they could understand. One photograph drew the most attention. I called it "The Empty Table." A small wooden chair sat at a child's party table, balloons deflated in the background, a plate with untouched cupcakes resting at its center. People lingered there the longest, tilting their heads, eyes softening as though they recognized the shape of absence. For me, it was the memory of my 10th birthday, the day I waited alone in a park until the sun went down. But for them, it was something else. Proof, maybe, that neglect has a universal language. I overheard a woman murmur, "It feels like someone's whole life right there in that chair." Her companion nodded, silent. And then through the crowd I saw him. Jonathan. He wasn't in a tuxedo this time, no spotlight following his every move. He wore a simple navy jacket. His tie loosened his expression weary, but free in a way I hadn't seen before. He stopped in front of me, holding his glass loosely, and for a moment we just looked at each other, acknowledging everything without needing words. Then he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Thank you. You saved me from a marriage that would have been a lie. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay that, but I needed you to hear me say it." I gave him a faint smile. "I didn't do it for you," I said gently. "Not cruel, just honest. But I'm glad you're free." He nodded, his eyes soft with something like respect. Then he moved on, blending into the crowd, just another guest who had come to see the truth. I let myself breathe in the moment. My work lined these walls, and for once I wasn't invisible. I was seen not as Lydia's sister, not as Margaret's disappointment, but as Clara Whitman, an artist with her own name and her own voice. The evening stretched on, and the city lights outside glowed against the gallery windows. As the last cluster of visitors lingered near the exit, I felt a shift in the air. I turned and saw her. Margaret. She stood on the sidewalk beyond the glass, no pearls, no entourage, just a dark coat drawn around her shoulders. The rain had returned, soft but steady, streaking her hair and glistening on her skin. She didn't come inside. She didn't wave. She only watched from across the glass, her face lined with exhaustion, her eyes unreadable. For a long minute, neither of us moved. The world went on around her. Cabs splashing through puddles, people rushing past with umbrellas. But she stayed fixed in place. I reached for my camera almost by instinct and lifted it. Through the raindrops on the window, I captured her. My mother stripped of her throne, standing alone under a storm she couldn't control. When I printed it later, I gave it a caption in small letters at the bottom. "Sometimes silence is enough." As the last guests left, and the gallery lights dimmed, I stood in the quiet of my own making. The echoes of laughter and cruelty finally fading into something I could live with. My voice carried one last thought, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been handed scraps at their own family's table. I once sat at my sister's wedding with nothing but a dry piece of bread. They thought that was all I was worth. But the truth, justice, and my art became the only answer I ever needed. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced injustice inside your own family? Have you ever carried silence when you should have spoken? Share your story below. Because sometimes when we put our truths together, none of us has to feel alone.